Good afternoon. My name is Justine Leigh, and I'm the Deputy CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. And it's with great pleasure to be here today for Viva's 2020 online conference, which the theme is Green Finance for Low Carbon, Climate Resilient Infrastructure. It is a pleasure to be here. And today, I'm going to discuss what we have seen as an absolute phenomenon in the debt capital markets over the last 10 years. Bond. Green bonds have become an absolute sensation globally. And today I will go through sort of the journey at which this market has developed and how green bonds are serving as an instrumental tool in being able to move capital into the infrastructure space. It's important to know where the demand is coming from, what's driving this market. And I'd say that in the early days of the development of the market, a number of institutional investors in the European community started to look beyond just the financial risks of their portfolio. They began to pay attention to the risks that climate, most notably, was posing on their portfolios. Also looking at other environmental and social risks that were emerging. And so from that came this interest in how can we move, in the case of investors, move our money into the future, in what needs to be the future in terms of ensuring a sustainable economies going forward. And so the development finance institutions like the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, started to put out debt products that was speaking directly to these institutional investors with investments that were doing exactly that. They were investments around, most notably, renewable energies like wind and solar, low carbon transport investments, and this became something that interested investors quite a bit. Most importantly, because the mandates that investors were starting to make, their commitments to expanding their commitments around climate and ESG, the environmental and social governance frameworks, it became very apparent that they needed to start finding those investments. And so I would say that the development banks were a pioneer in getting this market started. As you can see in this slide, that the breakdown of different investors not only just includes pensions, it also includes our fund managers, our insurance industries, and even our sovereign wealth. And to the right, you can see some of the most well-known commitments made by investors on the global stage on their commitment towards climate change. Now, first, it's important, before really getting into the details, it's important to know what actually a green bond is. And it's a product that essentially acts exactly like any other bond instrument. So, they're not necessarily as novel as we all think, right? Bonds are bonds. They are debt products that allow for investments to be made on large-scale infrastructure projects. And here we've got a breakdown of the different components. So fundamentally, the difference between a green bond and a regular bond are, one, what is being financed. So with green bonds, it's absolutely critical that what is being financed is actually delivering on an environmental positive objective. And so this is not mixing your investments with fossil fuel assets, for example. For example, we would not want to see a portfolio with wind and solar projects and also coal-fired electricity projects. This would be 100% eligible projects and assets financed by the green bond. There is also the transparency and disclosure that comes around green bonds. Very clear reporting requirements around how the proceeds are being managed and the reporting on those for the life term of the bond. So as you can see here, the green bonds have comparable pricing. They're refinancing projects as much as they're new projects. And what we've seen notably is many are, it's within the investment grade scale, although as the pressure within the developed economies looking for yield, emerging markets are beginning to see a huge increase in demand for sovereign green bonds coming out of the emerging markets because of the yield appetite that's coming from the developed economies, a huge opportunity that is presenting itself to many countries around the world. In the reporting, we are looking for, what we need to see is an independent review, some sort of verification that is ensuring that what the issuer is actually putting out into the market is credible. And this also comes down to the reporting on those use of proceeds. Now, any entity can issue. Governments, like I said, development finance institutions, corporates, municipalities. The whole point is, if you can issue a regular bond, you can issue a green bond, as long as you have the appropriate assets to issue against. Now, why are issuers issuing green bonds? Mainly because this is a chance to diversify the investor base. The diversification of investors has been a huge selling point for issuers. Every issuer that is coming to market is gaining a new set of issuers, new set of investors that they've never been able to access before. And when they come back as repeat issuers, they're also gaining new issuers. And the same investors are coming back again and again. So investors, huge demand, issuers are being able to access those new investors. There's also a deeper engagement, both internally and externally. Internally, with different teams that may never have been engaging before. For example, the sustainability director is finally having a chance to engage with the director of treasury. Two different positions that probably never spoke to each other before are now having a conversation. And then, of course, externally, it is a chance to promote an issuer's commitment towards its environmental objectives, its sustainability agendas. It is a huge, huge chance for promotion on that side and engagement with the external community. Of course, there's a reputational advantage to this, a marketing, as you would say, but one that isn't honest marketing because of the way in which the green bond demands transparency and disclosure and proper reporting on the back of it. It's essentially a chance to really promote the goodwill of the issuing entity. And again, its commitments to being able to finance its or work towards financing its sustainability plans. And then finally, pricing. Pricing has definitely picked up as a huge attention in the market, particularly in the international market, where we have seen a bit of price pressure taking shape for green bonds because of the amount of demand there is in the market and not enough supply to meet that demand. So naturally, we are beginning to see price. And this is something that at Climate Bonds Initiative, our markets team tracks the market quite closely each on quarter to make sure that we can keep up with those developments and report on them accordingly. Now, this is an important piece to look at. The exceptional growth that you see here from 2014 to 2019 is giving you a sense of scale. We've gone from 3 billion USD of issuance back in the 2012-2013 period to now be over 800 billion outstanding in the market to date. Year on year, not only are we seeing a massive increase in issuance, we're also seeing a diversity of different types of issuers coming to the market. So really the year 2014 was the year of the green bond. Shortly after IFC issued its benchmark issuance of 1 billion euros, it got the took the market by storm. And this also signaled to corporates that this was something that they could do as well. So by the end of 2014, we had Unilever, EDF, several different corporates coming to market, showing that this market could actually happen. In 2015 is when other countries around the world started to pay attention, most notably China. And this is where China, recognizing its huge challenges on environmental risks, so much so that it posed national security issues. And therefore, where there could be an opportunity to tap new sources of capital to address that, taking note that even China, with the largest public sector economy, does not have enough public sector funds to be able to fund what needs to be done. And so it was integral that China began to make plans for how it was going to bring in international capital, as much as mobilizing its domestic capital to start addressing its environmental risks. And so by 2016, after putting in place the foundations of market infrastructure to be able to issue these types of bonds, China went from zero issuance in 2015 to close to 40 billion in 2016. And so that jump that you see from 2015 to 2016 is very much the entrance of China. And since then, China has paved the way for other emerging economies around the world to participate in this market. And so you can see from the diversity of issuers, anywhere from non-financial corporates to financial corporates to development banks and local governments. But I have to say, in 2017, the story really was around sovereigns. And this is where sovereigns began to pay attention and realize that with all the types of emerging economies that were in need of capital to finance their commitments towards climate change, climate policies coming on deck, that they needed to be able to connect themselves to the investors that were looking to invest in this space. And so some of the first entrants was Fiji, France, Nigeria, Ireland, Chile, Mexico now recently issuing, Germany has just recently issued this year. We've got 20 plus sovereigns that have come to market in the last 3 years. It really is quite a movement and one of the major asset classes of the green bonds market to date. And we expect to see a lot more, particularly in light of the current pandemic that is hitting the economy. We are looking at the way in which sovereign green bonds can come in and play a role in post-COVID recovery stimulus packaging. And this is definitely something that we have seen coming out of the European community, where 30% of the 750 billion euro rescue package to address COVID impacts, 30% of that is being looked to be financed through green bonds. So that's just to give you a sense of scale and fast track development that this market has taken. And as we go into this year, we have seen that green bonds has remained a stable product, one that has continued to hold its own in the market, where investors are keen to continue to invest in green bonds for every green bond that's coming to the market and holding on to those investments as well. It's also good to know, well, where are the proceeds for green bonds going? And, there's been extensive amount of work, which I will touch on later in the presentation, about how to define and where the opportunities are within the green investment space. But of course, think of it as, every single sector of the global, every major sector of the global economy must transition. We need a deep decarbonization across our sectors. And we also need to ensure that we are accounting for resilience in those sectors in light of the current impacts we are already experiencing with climate change. Climate change is already in the system. And so there are areas, particularly in our water sectors, particularly in our land use sectors, where we do need to consider resilience very, very carefully. Now, of course, you can see from this slide the different areas of investments that we have seen green bonds tied to. Of course, energy is one of the largest shares, anywhere from 35 to 40% year on year. And this is really because the advancements that the energy sector has made in the last decade, the large-scale implementation of renewables, this has been absolutely prime for green bonds. What we've also seen is in the buildings and transport space, energy efficient buildings across commercial and residential, family units, social housing. All of these have been huge areas of investments with green bonds. Of course, transport itself, public mass transit systems, better connectivity across our cities from one city to the next, high-speed rail, trams, metro lines, bus rapid transit systems, rail. These are all extremely well received investments for green bonds by investors because naturally they are low carbon assets, particularly when you're looking at the rail sector. And so this is something that we've been seeing increasingly over the course of the development of the market. And then, of course, other areas, as I'd mentioned, water, particularly looking at the security of water supply and ensuring that we are better management with those systems, and also things like land use, whether we're talking about forestry, sustainable agriculture, a huge opportunity for Brazil, as Climate Bonds Initiative has been emphasizing over the years in its work in Brazil. Then, of course, this is something that we think Brazil will be leading on in the years ahead. But the take-home message here is that every major sector, identifying the key investments in those sectors to transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. And of course, that touches on mitigation as much as it touches on adaptation and resilience. There is also the rules of the game. Okay, when issuing a green bond, it's not so much about self-declaring. You know, if you think that you have a green bond to issue, there are some steps that need to be taken to ensure the credibility of that label for investors, because investors will be looking for certain characteristics and a process to be taking place when issuing a green bond. In 2014, the Green Bond Principles, which is managed by the International Capital Markets Association, ICMA, put in place a set of principles that really gave guidance to the market on what are the key steps when issuing a green bond, and what do you need to make sure that you are abiding by when issuing a green bond. And those are four very key areas. One is the use of proceeds, identifying the eligible projects and assets, going through a process of screening your portfolio and putting together the right pool of assets that can be issued against a green bond. The second is your internal management systems on how you're going to manage the proceeds during the term of the bond. There's the external review, bringing in a verifier to verify the portfolio that has been identified for the green bond. And then finally is the reporting, the ongoing commitment to report over the life term of the bond. And since we've seen the green bond principles, we've also seen the emergence of the social bond principles and the sustainability bond guidelines, each of those speaking directly to the nature of the portfolio. And so if it is investments that are geared predominantly around social benefits, then the social bond principles are the ideal frameworks to abide by. And if you are looking at mixing your portfolio with both green projects and assets and social projects and assets, then it's likely that you would be referring to the sustainability bond guidelines. Of course, there's been huge developments associated with the Sustainable Development Goals. And by the 17 goals that are a commitment to improve the opportunities for achieving sustainable development, being able to match those investments to some of those goals has been a development that has been taking shape in the market. Now, the Climate Bonds Initiative, since the early days of the market, since 2013, had put in place a standards and certification scheme that sits on the back of the principles and allows for a proper assurance model for certifying the bond. And that is something that has been emerging globally since the 2013 period. Climate Bonds Initiative has also been there to help define what is green. What do we mean by green investments? And that has been a piece of work that has involved technical experts from around the world and industry experts from around the world coming together to sketch out exactly what we mean by green in light of climate change, underpinned by Paris-aligned commitments made by countries around the world. And so from those guidance, those voluntary pieces of guidance that hit the market in the early days and continue to serve as the referencing for the market, have been taken up by many regulators around the world in helping to provide guidance in their local markets. And regulators have now been really taking an active role in this space, and where we've seen probably one of the most advanced developments has been with the European Commission, where back in 2016, the European Commission started to look at what they needed to do to be able to put in place an EU-wide sustainable finance action plan. And in that action plan was also putting in place a taxonomy. And a taxonomy is something that CBI had put in place in 2013, of which the European Commission referenced and took that as a chance to build off of and expand that into the European market. And now with the launch of the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy in July, put out by the European Commission, other countries around the world have been looking to do exactly the same process, basing the foundation around what the EU has put out and look to see how that applies in their local markets and where there shall be further developments to make those that taxonomy adaptable into their markets. Of course, also part of this has been putting in place guidelines, how to issue green bonds that, are expected to be abided by in the local markets. And these have been very much based on the green bond principles and the climate bond standard. And many of the type of bodies that have taken that on have been securities and exchange commissions. In some cases, it's been capital market regulator forums and membership entities. It really just depends on the jurisdiction at hand, but stock exchanges, SECs, in some cases, finance ministries have set those benchmarks and taken those rules forward. The taxonomy, as I had mentioned, is a word that you probably will be hearing if you are tapped into this market. You will hear this word quite a bit. Again, like I said, Climate Bonds Initiative was the first to put a taxonomy into the market in 2013, and of which then has now been picked up by China's People's Bank of China, the PBOC, and the European Commission, of which the taxonomy has been expanding to also accommodate those markets. And as we can see, there is a number of countries now, and we've seen in Latin America, Colombia specifically, Chile, who have all been taking up the process of developing national taxonomies based off of what has been developing internationally. And so a taxonomy is essentially a list out of the areas of green investments across the key sectors. It's really sort of, think of it as the catalog. You're picking up a catalog as an issuer to understand exactly where your portfolios sit against the taxonomy. And so as you can see to the left for energy, you've got solar investments, you have wind investments, geothermal, bioenergy, hydropower, marine renewables, transmission and distribution and storage. Now, of course, some of those may be subject to criteria, to some set parameters to ensure that they will actually deliver a positive environmental impact. For example, in hydropower, large-scale hydropower in tropical zones can potentially have large reservoirs that can lead to methane emissions. So things like that need to be monitored. They need to be checked and reported on. But of course, where those thresholds are within reason, those assets are eligible for green bonds. Of course, when you talk about wind and solar, these are straightforward low carbon assets. There isn't a carbon footprint requirement or measurements required for those assets because they are straightforward low carbon assets. You can also see in the transport sector, we've got, as I said, some public mass transit systems, freight rail. We are looking at aviation. Of course, this is a work in progress, given the complication of or high, the high carbon emissions that comes with the sector. But there are opportunities for transitioning, and this is very much a lot of the attention being made for aviation. But again, the main point is, there will be assets that are straightforward. There will be others that will require further criteria development, and this is areas of work that is currently underway. But this is just to give you a sense of the opportunity, and by no means is this a limited list. This is just a high-level, quick view for you to see. If you're interested to see more detail of the taxonomy, please see the link that is included in this slide. For more information is available at standards.climatebonds.net/taxonomy, and there you will see more detail and more sectors with more information. Now, if I was a municipality or if I was federal government and I was interested in actually issuing green bonds, of course, there's all different ways in which that planning can take shape. I mean, it could be where it's just about issuing one bond, or it could be developing a program itself. But again, the first and most important step is identifying the projects. So whether you're a state utility, a city department, you're a transit agency, you're a ministry, sovereign level, you're at sub-sovereign level, the most important thing is looking at the capital expenditure program and identifying and prioritizing the projects using a taxonomy. So the taxonomy is your procurement list. It allows for you to identify through a screening on which projects are eligible and which projects may not be. And this is that first step, is the screening. Of course, then the second is putting together your green bond framework or your green bond program framework, which will basically follow the principles of the green bond principles as mentioned earlier. It lays out those 4 key requirements around how were the projects identified, what resources were used, justification for why those assets are considered to be a part of the green bond program. How are your internal procedures for managing proceeds? How will you report on those proceeds? So think about that being captured in a framework. Then an independent verifier will come in and review and sign off on so that you can now then come to market. And so once the issuance is in place, and the bond comes to market and the allocation of the proceeds has taken hold, there is then the post-issuance phase of when the verifier comes back to check compliance, and then off we go. And then it is just simply a reporting each year, nothing long, nothing arduous, just a very simple reporting component of the compliance of the green bond. So the outlook, there's so much more detail around all of this. If only there was enough time to be able to run through it all. But I hope that you're able to get a sense of what we have been seeing in this market, the opportunities this market presents itself with, and especially for governments, this is really the time to be looking into this market quite seriously, because with the amount of demand that investors have on the desire for investing in green bonds, the chance to leverage green bonds as an investment tool to be able to address the climate policies, the environmental challenges, and even now with the impact of the pandemic, this is the time more than ever to be looking at how to tap the international capital markets and potentially sourcing cheaper forms of capital to make these investments, these huge investments required to be able to meet the challenge we have. Now, of course, some of the outlook really has been about the opportunity for green infrastructure. Again, coming back to that point of transport specifically and energy specifically, on how we can now start to access a cap to really roll out our renewable energy systems, our transmissions, and our transport sector transport infrastructure opportunities. This is really the time to be looking at this, and we do expect to see huge advancements in this space. Blended finance, where there is challenges in straightforward bond financing, is also something that has been emerging. And this is obviously a very essential de-risking mechanism that has been looked at in the years prior. And the rise of the sovereigns, as I said, I think we'll expect to see a lot more sovereigns coming to market in the year ahead, both from developed and emerging economies. We see international standards, taxonomies. This is a developing story, but it is one that is going through a harmonization stage where now is the convergence of what is happening around the world into a common set of definitions on where the investments are for achieving our climate goals. And I think that especially if we look in the Latin American economies, we are beginning to see a lot of momentum on this side. Regulators are increasingly stepping up, increasingly paying attention to this market, whether it be Securities and Exchange Commissions, pension regulators, our insurance regulators, including our central banks. I think this is a huge development this year that we have seen, and we expect to see more. And the role that they will play in ensuring the right market infrastructure is in place to scale up locally. Investor demands will continue to increase. We have seen in light of the pandemic, the demand has increased tenfold. When we didn't think it could any more than it was, investors have woken up that there are linkages here. There are risks here. Shocks to the system is not something that a globalized economy is adapted to. And so being able to look going forward on how we better invest in our systems is at the very top of the agenda for investors around the world. Of course, we are very focused on the role that banks will play. We need more banks to lead on green bonds, more credit lines, more lending opportunities for green, and being able to help drive the market during this period. So with that, I will end and say thank you very much for your time. I hope that this has been a presentation that you can walk away with to at least get the high-level overview of this market. And should you have any further questions or interests, you can find us at www.climatebonds.net. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your conference.